cold case dating back nearly a half century appears to have been cracked this week. Investigators in Pennsylvania arrested David Sinopoli in the 1975 murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler. Bradley Blackburn is here to explain how police were able to track down Sinopoli across the decades. Good morning, Bradley.
Dana, good morning. It was DNA evidence used to crack so many unsolved cases. Investigators say they matched Sinopoli's biological thumbprint back to that 1975 crime scene. But how they used that DNA to find him might surprise you.
The knocking stops. No answer. Her aunt pushes the door open anyway. The lights are on. Everything looks normal. The grocery bag still sitting on the counter, never put away. Then her eyes reach the living room floor. Lindy isn't moving. There's a knife in her neck. It matches a knife from her own kitchen set. And wrapped around the handle, someone has tied a towel. Carefully, deliberately, like they didn't want to leave anything behind. For the next 46 years, no one will know who did this. Not because there were no clues, because the one clue that mattered wasn't sitting in a database or a fingerprint file. It was buried in a family tree, on the other side of the world, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Today, we're looking at the case of Lindy Sue Biechler, a case that helped change how we solve cold cases forever. If you love deep, true crime mysteries told simply and honestly, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. But before any of that, there was just a girl, a marriage barely more than a year old, and a Friday evening that should have ended with dinner. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19. In a lot of ways, she was still becoming who she was going to be, still learning how to run a household, still figuring out what kind of adult she wanted to be, still learning to cook for her new husband. What people remembered about her, years later, wasn't anything dramatic. It was smaller than that. Phil Biechler and Lindy Sue married in October of 1974. 1 year later, they were still in that early stretch of marriage where you're learning the small things about each other, how the other person takes their coffee, which chores fall to who, what a Friday night at home actually looks like. Phil worked at Hertz Rent-A-Car while he studied art at Millersville University. Lindy worked at Landis Flowers and Gifts in Manor Township, owned by a man named Bob Aument. She'd been hired that June, initially for administrative work, though she found herself drawn to arranging the flowers instead. They didn't have money. They didn't have a big apartment or a nice car. What they had was each other, and by every reliable account from the people who knew them, that seemed to be enough. Investigators found no evidence that Lindy had known enemies or any obvious reason someone would want to harm her. In the weeks before December 5th, later accounts of the case say Lindy told friends and family she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She never identified anyone specifically, and investigators never established whether that feeling had any connection to her murder. Even so, after what happened, those conversations took on a haunting significance. On Friday, December 5th, Lindy worked her shift at the flower shop, stopped to see Phil at Hertz, and picked up groceries for dinner. She drove back to the Spring Manor Apartments on Kloss Drive in Manor Township and let herself into their first-floor apartment. She set the groceries on the counter. She never got the chance to put them away. Around 8:45 that evening, Lindy's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Merle Little, stopped by. They were driving home from a high school basketball game and decided to check in on their niece on the way. Her uncle waited in the car. Her aunt climbed the steps and knocked. What happened next is where this story actually begins, and you already know how it ends for Lindy. What you don't know yet is what the scene told investigators, and what it didn't. The apartment complex filled with police lights within minutes. Phil was pulled from his shift at Hertz and told his wife was gone. When detectives searched the apartment, what they found left them with more questions than answers. The medical examiner determined Lindy had been stabbed 19 times. She had fought, and fought hard. There was also evidence she'd been sexually assaulted. This hadn't been a quick, chaotic burst of violence that spiraled out of control. This had been an attack, sustained and deliberate. And yet the apartment itself told a contradictory story. There was no forced entry. The lock wasn't damaged. Nothing of value had been taken. 2 knives were used in the attack. Only one has ever been confirmed to have come from her own kitchen set. To investigators, the absence of forced entry mattered more than almost anything else at the scene. It meant one of two things. Either Lindy had opened the door herself, to someone she had no reason to fear, or someone was already inside when she got home. A Lancaster County detective who later worked the case said publicly that the evidence suggested she was attacked the moment she opened her door. Either way, the door itself told investigators the killer likely wasn't a stranger who'd broken in off the street. In a case with almost no physical evidence to work from, that single absence, no broken lock, no forced entry, became one of the few things detectives could actually reason from. Investigators quickly concluded that robbery did not appear to be the motive. This wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. The number of wounds itself became a piece of evidence. Investigators described the attack as overkill, far beyond what would have been needed to kill her. And that led them to a theory they couldn't prove, but also couldn't shake, that the killer knew Lindy personally, and may have been someone she had rejected. It was a theory that made sense of the violence, but it also meant the pool of possible suspects was, in theory, smaller and closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. And in 1975, with no way to test that theory against DNA, it went nowhere. Investigators considered whether whoever did this had been let inside, or knew the apartment well enough to already be there. Detectives moved on the obvious suspect first. In cases like this, the husband gets looked at closely, and Phil was no exception. But his alibi held completely. Confirmed at work at Hertz for the entire window of the murder. He was cleared within days and never seriously considered again. That left investigators with almost nothing solid to work from. There were no security cameras in 1975, no cell phone records, no digital trail of any kind. DNA profiling itself didn't exist yet as an investigative tool. The first criminal case anywhere to use DNA evidence wouldn't happen until the mid-1980s, and the FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS, wasn't established until 1994, nearly 20 years after Lindy was killed. In 1975, investigators had blood typing, fingerprints, and eyewitness accounts, and in this case, almost none of those had anything to work with. The case wasn't cold because detectives stopped trying. It was cold because the science that could have solved it hadn't been invented yet. Detectives canvassed the entire complex and beyond. Between 250 and 300 people were interviewed in the weeks that followed. Every name got run down. Every alibi got checked. And one by one, every lead dissolved into nothing. By the spring of 1976, the investigation had slowed dramatically as leads dried up. The town's grief didn't disappear, but it settled into something heavier, a low sadness that hung over Manor Township like weather that wouldn't clear. And then, almost exactly 1 year later, the person responsible decided they weren't finished. On December 26, 1976, Lindy's headstone at Boehm's United Methodist Church Cemetery in Pacoima Township was found vandalized, spray-painted red, chipped and nicked. Police weren't sure at first whether this was cruel, unrelated vandalism, or something far worse. They got their answer just over a week later. On January 5, 1977, a letter arrived at Manor Township Police, written across the front, in large block letters, urgent. Inside was a handwritten note, referencing the vandalism at the grave, written as though it came from the killer himself. Police suspected it might be a hoax and kept it from the public for more than 2 decades. When the letter was finally released in the year 2000, an FBI behavioral specialist who reviewed it said it was unlikely the killer had written it himself, though whoever did may have had some indirect connection to him. The letter raised a question that would hang over the case for decades. Was it a cruel hoax from someone with no real connection to the murder, or a sign that whoever was behind it knew the killer, maybe even knew Lindy, closely enough to feel safe hiding in plain sight? The years that followed tested every tool available to law enforcement at the time. Detectives interviewed hundreds more people. In the early 1980s, the district attorney's office quietly paid 2 psychics from California, hoping for answers police work alone hadn't produced. It went nowhere. Periodically, a new name surfaced. In 1982, investigators looked hard at Gerald Eugene Stano, a mass murderer whose own father lived in the area, and he was ruled out within months. A similar stabbing death in nearby Columbia, Pennsylvania, briefly raised the possibility of a connection. Investigators concluded it wasn't related. Each lead, run down completely, came back empty. By every measure available in the 1970s and 1980s, this case had become unsolvable. Not because nobody was trying, because there was simply nothing left to try. No single solid lead ever surfaced again. A decade passed, then two. The original detectives who had first worked the case in 1975 aged out of the department, retiring with it still open, still unsolved, still the one that got away. In 1992, the case was picked up again by Joseph Giese, newly retired as Lancaster City Police's head detective, now working unsolved murders for the county. He inherited a file built by officers who had already retired, on a case that had outlived every lead it once had. Phil rebuilt a life around a wound that never fully closed. He remarried years later, but he never stopped wondering who had done this, and why. Every anniversary of that December evening brought the same questions back with it. Lindy's parents grew older, carrying the particular grief of a case with no resolution, not just mourning a daughter, but mourning her without ever being able to answer the most basic question a family in their position needs answered. Who? For decades, that word simply had no answer attached to it. The town itself changed. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. For most people who hadn't lived through it, the murder became something older relatives brought up around the holidays, a half-remembered tragedy rather than a lived one. But for the people who had actually known Lindy, the case never really faded. It just went quiet, the way old grief does, waiting. By the year 2000, the case existed as a dusty box in a records room, one of many unsolved homicide files the department was still technically responsible for, but had no active way to pursue. But while the case sat cold, the science underneath it kept moving. In the year 2000, detectives went back to the physical evidence preserved from the original crime scene. Using the DNA technology available at the time, they managed to isolate a male genetic profile from evidence at the scene. They ran it against the National Criminal Database. Nothing matched. A no-match result in a criminal database doesn't clear anyone. It only means the person's DNA wasn't already in the system, typically because they'd never been arrested and profiled for a qualifying offense. For this case, it meant the killer was, as of the year 2000, still not in the system, but it gave investigators no name and no new lead. The sample itself, though, was preserved, and that decision, to keep the evidence rather than let it degrade or get discarded, is what made everything that came nearly 2 decades later even possible. Another 2 decades passed before anyone tried again. In 2019, District Attorney Craig Stedman's office sent the preserved DNA sample to a private lab called Parabon Nanolabs. On September 5, 2019, scientists released computer-predicted images of what the killer might have looked like. One estimate around age 25, another around age 65. The images went out to local news. Tips came in. None of them led anywhere. But Parabon had one more resource, and it turned out to be the one that actually mattered. A genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore. In December of 2020, the district attorney's office asked Parabon to go further. C.C. doesn't work the way a typical crime lab does. Instead of searching for an exact match in a criminal database, she uploads crime scene DNA to the same public genealogy websites ordinary people use to build their own family trees. Her goal isn't to find the killer directly, it's to find his distant relatives, people who share only a small fraction of his DNA, and then work backward, reconstructing the family tree until his name eventually falls out of it. This technique barely existed as a law enforcement tool before 2018, when investigators first used it to identify the Golden State Killer after decades of dead ends. Lindy's case was one of hundreds of cold cases across the country that got a second look because of that breakthrough. It isn't an exaggeration to say the tool that finally solved this case didn't exist for the first 43 years it sat unsolved. When Cece began working the case, the matches she found were distant, nowhere near a single obvious relative. It would take painstaking work to narrow them down. But as she mapped out where those distant matches came from, a pattern started to form. They all traced back to the same part of the world, a small town in southern Italy. That region had sent a number of immigrant families to Lancaster County in the early 1900s, which meant ancestry alone wasn't enough. She needed a family where both the maternal and paternal lines led back to that same part of Italy. The work took months, reconstructing family trees branch by branch, methodically, because genetic genealogists don't get to guess. Every connection has to be documented, since it may eventually have to hold up in a courtroom, not just satisfy an investigator. Eventually, the family tree narrowed to one branch, with ties to Lancaster County going back generations. From there, investigators worked to identify which of the men in that family could realistically have been in the area and connected to the case in 1975. One by one, names were ruled out. The wrong age, the wrong place, no connection at all, until a handful of candidates remained. And then, one name remained: David Sinopoli. The name meant nothing to investigators. He had never been considered a suspect. By the time investigators had a name, David Sinopoli was 68 years old, a father, living an ordinary life. What investigators discovered next was something neither family had ever put together. Lindy and David Sinopoli had crossed paths long before 1975. As children, starting around age 9 and 11, the two had lived about a mile apart in Lancaster City for roughly 6 years, she with her mother and stepfather, he with his mother, each part of a family reshaped by divorce and remarriage. That detail changes how investigators eventually came to understand this case. This wasn't a stranger who wandered in from outside her world. It was someone whose childhood had once run parallel to hers, in a different part of town, years before either of them had any reason to think of the other again. For decades, through thousands of interviews and pages of case files, David Sinopoli's name never came up once. Not as a person of interest, not even as a passing mention in anyone's notes. He had simply never made it onto anyone's radar, not because he'd covered his tracks with any particular skill, but because in 1975, there had been no way to connect a childhood acquaintance, neither family remembered, to a crime scene that had left behind so little usable evidence. A family tree, no matter how precise, isn't evidence a prosecutor can take to trial. Genetic genealogy can point investigators toward a name, but it can't convict anyone on its own. They needed a direct, modern DNA sample from Sinopoli himself, one they could compare against the profile pulled from the 1975 crime scene. And they needed it without tipping him off that he was suddenly, after nearly 5 decades, a suspect in a murder. So they started watching him. Quietly, detectives began tracking his routine, waiting for a moment where he'd discard something ordinary, something he'd never think twice about, that could still carry his DNA. Genetic genealogy could point to a name, but it couldn't put handcuffs on anyone. To do that, investigators needed Sinopoli's own DNA, collected in a way that would hold up in court, and legally, that meant they couldn't simply walk up and ask for a sample from a man who had no idea he was a suspect. What they could do, under long-standing law, was collect something he had already thrown away. Courts have consistently held that once someone discards an item in public, a cup, a napkin, a cigarette butt, they no longer have a legal expectation of privacy in it. That was the narrow legal window investigators were working inside of. That moment came on February 11, 2022, at Philadelphia International Airport. Detectives had been watching Sinopoli, and before boarding a flight, he bought a coffee. There was real risk in it. If he carried the cup onto the plane, the chance was gone. Before boarding, Sinopoli discarded the empty cup. Once he was gone, detectives recovered it and sealed it as evidence. The DNA was sent for testing. For investigators who had spent months building the case through painstaking genealogical research, the wait for results was almost unbearable. If the DNA didn't match, the entire genealogical trail would collapse, and they'd be back to nothing. By April of that year, it matched. The statistical odds that the DNA on that cup belonged to anyone other than David Sinopoli were roughly 1 in 10 trillion. On Sunday, July 17, 2022, David Sinopoli was arrested at his East Hempfield Township home, nearly 46 years after Lindy's murder. For the community, someone so unremarkable suddenly being the answer was almost impossible to process. Facing the DNA evidence and no plausible alternative explanation, Sinopoli's defense had nowhere to go. On October 19, 2023, before Lancaster County President Judge David Ashworth, he pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. A guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no months of pre-trial motions, no possibility of an acquittal, and no need for Lindy's family to sit through a jury weighing 48-year-old evidence. It also meant the case was resolved with certainty, rather than a verdict that could theoretically be appealed on the facts. For a family that had waited nearly half a century for any resolution at all, the plea closed the case in the most final way the law allows. Phil Biechler sat in that courtroom, decades after being wrongly shadowed by suspicion he never deserved, and watched the man responsible finally face consequences. Sinopoli was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, which, given his age of 69, the judge called effectively a life sentence. For Phil, and for what remained of Lindy's family, the guilty plea didn't undo the 48 years that had passed. It couldn't give back a marriage barely more than a year old, or answer the smaller, quieter question of who Lindy might have become if she'd been allowed to grow older. What it did was close a door that had been left open for almost half a century, a door that had shaped an entire family's relationship to grief, because grief without an answer behaves differently than grief that's allowed to resolve. For the detectives who had spent careers on this file and the genealogist who found the one branch that mattered, it was proof that patience, not luck, is usually what finally closes a case like this one. That's how long the truth stayed hidden, long enough for a quiet, unremarkable man to grow old and unremarkable inside it. This case wasn't solved because someone confessed. It wasn't solved because a forgotten fingerprint suddenly appeared. It was solved because detectives refused to give up, and because genetic genealogy uncovered the one clue that had been there all along. Cases like this one have become part of a larger pattern. Since forensic genetic genealogy entered mainstream use, hundreds of decades-old cold cases across the United States have been resolved the same way, not through a new witness or a deathbed confession, but through DNA that had been sitting in evidence storage for years, finally paired with tools that didn't exist when the crime happened. Lindy Sue Biechler's case is one of the clearest examples of how a killer's own family tree, built by strangers with no idea they were related to him, can end up being the thing that finds him. After nearly half a century, Lindy Sue Biechler's family finally had an answer. Cases like this don't just end with an arrest. They remind us that even after decades, the truth can still be found. Every week, we bring you carefully researched stories about the victims, the investigations, and the breakthroughs that finally brought answers. If you want to support this work and make sure you never miss a new case, subscribe to Just Crime Talks. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these stories. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.